The Atlantic Ocean, July 1839. Night falls across the water like a curtain drawn over a secret. On the deck of a Spanish schooner named La Amistad, meaning friendship, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that the slave traders could not have imagined. Something that would shake the courts of America, rattle the halls of power in Spain, and echo through the long, painful history of the African diaspora. Among the hundreds of human beings crammed into the hold of that ship, one man had made a decision. His name was Sengbe Pieh. You may know him as Joseph Sinke. And on this night, on this ship, he was not a slave. He was a warrior, a father, a leader, a man who refused to die in chains. This is not just the story of one man. This is the story of 53 Africans, Mende people, kidnapped from their homeland in West Africa, who rose up, took control of a slave ship, and fought their way through one of the most dramatic legal battles in American history. This is the Amistad. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. Today we journey into one of the most remarkable, most inspiring, and most frequently misunderstood chapters in the history of the African people. The year is 1839. The transatlantic slave trade, though officially banned by Britain and the United States, is still raging along the West African coast. Thousands of African men, women, and children are being captured, sold, and shipped across the ocean every year. In this world of violence, greed, and human misery, a group of Mende people from the region we now call Sierra Leone are ripped from their homes, their families, their entire world. They are taken to Havana, Cuba, one of the last great hubs of the illegal slave trade, and then loaded onto a small coastal vessel called La Amistad. But what happens next will change history forever. In this documentary, we will walk through every chapter of this incredible saga. We'll explore who the Mende people were, their culture, their values, their homeland. We'll follow the journey of Sengbe Pieh, from rice farmer and father to revolutionary leader. Will witness the uprising, the blood, the bravery, the impossible gamble for freedom. Will sit in the courtrooms of America, where the fate of these Africans was decided by judges who had never walked the forests of Sierra Leone, and will reveal the hidden truths, the stories that mainstream history has minimized, distorted, or simply left out. Stay with us, because this story belongs to Africa and it is long overdue. To understand the Amistad, we must first understand the world from which Sengbe Pieh came. The early 1800s in West Africa, specifically in the region that forms modern-day Sierra Leone, was a world of immense cultural richness, complex politics, and deep spiritual tradition. The Mende people were one of the largest and most organized ethnic groups in this region. Their homeland stretched across dense rainforests, rolling hills, and the fertile valleys of the Sierra Leone interior. The Mende were not isolated. They were deeply connected to broader West African networks, trade routes that carried rice, iron, gold, and cloth across hundreds of miles. They had their own political structures, their own courts, their own systems of justice. Rice was the foundation of their economy. Mende farmers were masters of cultivation, flooding fields, rotating crops, reading the seasons. A man who could grow rice was a man who could sustain life. Sengbe Pieh was one such man. A rice farmer, a husband, a father of 3 children. The Mende world was structured around family, community, and the sacred Poro and Sunday societies, secret institutions that governed initiation, education, law, and spiritual life. The Poro society was for men. Through it, young men were initiated into adulthood, taught the values of their community, and trained in the responsibilities of leadership. The Sunday society was for women, equally powerful, equally important. Women in Mende society were not passive. They were economic actors, spiritual leaders, and community organizers. The Mende believed in a supreme being called Ngewo, a creator god, as well as a world of ancestors and spirits who remained connected to the living. Justice, community, and spiritual balance were central to their moral universe. Warriors were respected, but wisdom was revered even more. A man who could negotiate peace was worth more than a man who could only wage war. Sengbe Pieh would need to be both. But there was a shadow falling over this world. The transatlantic slave trade had been devastating West Africa for over 300 years. By 1839, entire communities had been shattered. Millions of people, estimates range from 12 to 15 million souls, had been torn from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic. By the early 1800s, both Britain and the United States had officially banned the transatlantic slave trade. Britain even deployed a naval squadron, the West Africa Squadron, specifically to intercept slave ships. But the ban had not stopped the trade. It had only made it more violent, more secretive, and more profitable. Slavers adapted, ships became faster to outrun the British Navy, captives were packed even more tightly to make each voyage more profitable, and the interior of West Africa, away from the coastal patrols, became a hunting ground. African rulers, warlords, and traders participated in this system, sometimes under coercion, sometimes for profit, sometimes both. The slave trade corrupted everything it touched. And in 1839, it touched Sengbe Pieh. To understand the second half of our setting, we must cross the Atlantic to Cuba. In 1839, Cuba was a Spanish colony and one of the most profitable sugar-producing territories on earth. The demand for enslaved African labor on Cuba's sugar plantations was insatiable. Spain and the United States had signed treaties agreeing that transatlantic slave trading would be abolished. But in practice, Cuba's slave market was booming. The Spanish colonial government looked the other way. Money flowed, people suffered. New Africans, people just captured from the continent who had never been enslaved before, were known as bozales. They were technically illegal under Spanish law, but they were profitable. And profit in 1839 was stronger than law. It was here, in the slave market of Havana, that Sengbe Pieh and his companions arrived in 1839. They had survived the Middle Passage, but their journey was not over. It was just beginning. We do not know exactly when Sengbe Pieh was born. We know he was a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, when he was captured in 1839. He came from the town of Mani in the interior of Sierra Leone. He was a Mende man, a farmer, a husband to a woman whose name has not been preserved by history, a father to 3 children whose names we also do not know. This is one of the cruelties of the historical record. The names of the enslaved are so often erased, even in stories where they triumphed. What we do know is this: Sengbe Pieh was not a chief or a warrior by former title. He was an ordinary man in the finest sense of that word, someone whose community depended on him and who took that responsibility seriously. When he was captured, taken by fellow Africans in a local raid, orchestrated by the broader slave trade, his first thought was not of himself, it was of escape, it was of return. That focus, that singular drive to get back to his family would drive every decision he made from that day forward, and it would make him a legend. Sengbe Pieh was not alone. He was one of 53 captive Africans aboard the Amistad when the rebellion occurred. These were not a random collection of individuals. They were mostly Mende, with a shared language, shared values, and a shared understanding of what it meant to be free. Among them were men of different backgrounds. farmers, hunters, a blacksmith. Some had been enslaved before within Africa. Others, like Sengbe, were newly captured. And among the 53 were 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. Their presence on that ship is a reminder of the full monstrous scale of what the slave trade was. It stole children from their mothers and shipped them across oceans. The children's names, or the names we know them by, were Teme, Kagne, Kale, and Magru. Magru, the girl who later went by the name Sarah Kinson, would survive the Amistad Saga and return to Africa, where she later attended college in Sierra Leone. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. On the other side of this story are 2 Spanish nationals, Don Jose Ruiz and Don Pedro Montes. Ruiz was a young Havana planter who paid roughly $450 per African, a fortune at the time, for 49 of the captives. He intended to transport them to his sugar plantation at Puerto Principe on the eastern coast of Cuba. Montes was an order trader who purchased 4 of the children for his own use. To conduct this illegal transaction legally on paper, Cuban authorities provided fraudulent Spanish passports for the Africans, documents that falsely identified them as Spanish-speaking, Cuba-born enslaved people. This legal fiction would become a central battleground in the trials to come. The Amistad itself was a 120-ton black schooner, a fast, sleek ship designed for coastal trading. Her captain was Ramon Ferrer, a Spaniard of middling reputation who earned his living ferrying people and cargo between Cuban ports. The crew consisted of 2 sailors, a cook named Celestino and Captain Ferrer himself. There was also 1 other passenger on board, Antonio, a young enslaved boy belonging to Captain Ferrer, who served as a cabin servant. Antonio's role in the events to come would be complicated and his ultimate fate tragic. Half a world away, as in the United States, another set of characters would be drawn into this story. Louis Tappan was a wealthy New York merchant and one of the most committed abolitionists in America. When news of the Amistad reached him, he immediately organized a legal defense committee. Roger Sherman Baldwin was a Connecticut attorney who would serve as the Africans' primary legal counsel. And in the most dramatic legal move of all, Tappan eventually persuaded former President John Quincy Adams, then 73 years old and serving in Congress, to argue the Africans' case before the United States Supreme Court. On the other side stood President Martin Van Buren, whose administration was under intense pressure from both Spain and southern slaveholders to hand the Africans back, which would mean certain death or re-enslavement. These were the forces that would collide in American courtrooms. But before any of that, before lawyers and judges and presidents, there was a single knight on the open sea. There was Sengbe Pieh with a nail in his hand and freedom in his heart. Early in 1839, Sengbe Pieh was walking along a road near his village when he was seized by a group of men. The details are murky, as they so often are when the enslaved tell their own stories and are not believed. What we know is that he was taken by force, bound, and marched to the coast. This was a process that could take days or weeks. Captives were chained together and marched through the forest in long lines, what historians call coffles. Each step took Sengbe Pieh farther from everything he had ever known. He was brought to the slave trading post of Lomboko, a fortress on an island off the Sierra Leone coast, operated by a Spanish-Cuban slave trader named Pedro Blanco. Lomboko was the largest slave trading operation in West Africa at the time. Thousands of Africans passed through its dungeons each year. At Lomboko, Sengbe Pieh would have encountered other captives from across the region, people speaking different languages from different communities, all united by the same terrifying uncertainty. He was held here for weeks, possibly months, Then he was loaded onto a Portuguese slave ship, the Tecora, and the Middle Passage began. The Middle Passage was the name given to the second leg of the Triangle Trade, the journey that carried enslaved Africans from the West African coast to the Americas. It was one of the most horrific journeys in human history. Captives were packed into ships so tightly they could barely move. Many were chained, lying on wooden shelves just 18 inches high. They lay in their own filth. They breathed foul air. Disease spread rapidly. Those who died were thrown overboard. The journey could last anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, depending on the winds and the route. For Sengbe Pieh and his companions, the Tecora carried them across the Atlantic in the dead of spring, 1839. Some captives chose death over this journey, refusing to eat or throwing themselves into the sea when brought above deck. Others prayed, others plotted, others simply endured. Sengbe Pieh endured, but he was already thinking. June 1839, Havana, Cuba. The Tecora arrived in Havana Harbor under the cover of night, a common practice used to avoid detection by the anti-slave trade patrols that occasionally operated in Cuban waters. Sengbe Pieh and his companions were taken to an illegal slave depot, possibly the El Baracun, where they were held, examined, and put up for sale. This is where Don Jose Ruiz and Don Pedro Montes entered the picture, purchasing the 53 Africans and arranging for them to be transported on the coastal schooner La Amistad to Puerto Príncipe. False documents were created. The Africans were given Spanish names on paper and declared to be Cuban-born, Spanish-speaking slaves, Ladinos, a legal category that would have made their transportation legal under Spanish law. The documents were lies. The men producing them knew it. The men buying the documents knew it. And in a few weeks, the entire world would know it. On June 28, 1839, the 53 Africans were loaded onto the Amistad. The ship set sail for Puerto Príncipe. It was expected to be a 3-day journey. It would become a journey that lasted years. There are different versions of what happened in the days before the uprising. What all accounts agree on is this. Sengbe Pieh found a loose nail, or perhaps a spike, somewhere in the hold of the ship. With this single piece of metal, he picked the lock of his chains. He was free, at least from the iron, but the ship still carried armed guards and the ocean still stretched in every direction. Sengbe Pieh moved carefully. He freed the man next to him, then another and another. Moving through the darkness, he spread not just freedom from chains, but the seed of a plan. In the cargo hold, the Africans discovered a crate of sugarcane machetes, tools intended for the plantation work they were being taken to. The brutal irony, the weapons of their future enslavement would become the weapons of their present liberation. The uprising began in the dark hours before dawn on July 2nd, 1839. Sengbe Pieh led the charge. Captain Ramon Ferrer fought back. He was killed during the struggle, along with the ship's cook Celestino, who had reportedly taunted the captives by telling them they were going to be eaten. The 2 sailors jumped overboard and swam away into the night. Don Jose Ruiz and Don Pedro Montes were captured, wounded but alive. Sengbe Pieh made the decision to spare them. This was not weakness, it was strategy. He needed someone who could navigate. Sengbe Pieh's plan was clear. Sail east toward the rising sun, sail back to Africa, return to Sierra Leone, return to family. He forced Montes, who had sailing experience, to navigate. He watched the sun during the day, ensuring the ship moved eastward. But at night, when Sengbe could not see the stars well enough to check their course, Montes secretly altered their heading. He sailed north and west toward the United States. This deception continued for weeks. The Amistad zigzagged through the Atlantic on a bizarre, erratic course that would later puzzle American authorities. The weeks at sea were brutal. Food and water ran low. Several of the Africans died from illness and dehydration during this period. The ship grew rancid. Hope, which had surged on the night of the rebellion, began to ebb. But Sengbe Pieh held his community together. He rationed resources, he maintained order, he kept the captives' morale alive through force of personality and shared purpose. In late August 1839, the Amistad limped into the waters off the coast of Long Island, New York. Sengbe Pieh and several of the men came ashore to find fresh water and food. They encountered local residents, white Americans, who stared in shock and fascination at these gaunt, free African men who had appeared seemingly from nowhere on a battered Spanish ship. Word spread quickly. On August 26, 1839, the USS Washington, an American naval survey brig commanded by Lieutenant Commander Thomas Gedney, spotted the Amistad drifting off the coast of Long Island. Gedney brought his ship alongside and boarded the Amistad. What he found astonished him. A battered vessel crewed by Africans with two bound Spanish men below deck. Ruiz and Montes immediately claimed they were victims of a murderous mutiny. They presented their fraudulent documents. They demanded the Africans be arrested. Gedney, sensing an opportunity for prize money rather than justice, took the Amistad into custody and sailed it to New London, Connecticut, specifically choosing Connecticut over New York because Connecticut law would allow him to claim salvage rights to the ship and its cargo. The 53 Africans were taken to New Haven, Connecticut and imprisoned while American authorities debated what to do with them. The greatest legal battle in antebellum American history was about to begin. Within days of the Amistad's arrival in Connecticut, a complex legal and political crisis erupted. Multiple parties were claiming rights over the Africans and the ship. Lieutenant Commander Gedney wanted salvage rights, a percentage of the ship's value. Don Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes wanted their property returned. The Spanish government, citing the Treaty of 1795, demanded the ship, its cargo, and the Africans be returned to Spain. President Van Buren's administration, desperate not to offend either Spain or southern slaveholders, wanted to quietly deport the Africans, and the abolitionists, led by Louis Tappan, wanted the Africans recognized as free people who had been kidnapped illegally. The central legal question was deceptively simple and explosively complex. Were these 53 people enslaved people and therefore property, as the fraudulent Spanish documents claimed, or were they free African-born people who had been kidnapped illegally and therefore had the right to defend themselves even with deadly force? Louis Tappan's Amistad Committee hired attorneys Roger Sherman Baldwin and Seth Staples to represent the Africans. They also made a powerful decision. They would bring the Africans' own voices into the courtroom. But first, someone had to talk to them. And no one in Connecticut spoke Mende. The abolitionists searched desperately for someone who could communicate with the Africans. They tried interpreters in New York and Boston. None could speak Mende. Finally, through the help of British anti-slavery contacts, they located James Covey, a young Mende man who had been liberated from a slave ship by the British Royal Navy and was now serving as a sailor in New York Harbor. When James Covey walked into the New Haven jail and spoke to Sengbe Pieh in Mende, their shared mother tongue, it was one of the most emotionally significant moments of the entire saga. Sengbe Pieh could finally tell his story. Through Covey, he gave testimony that would form the backbone of the Africans' legal defense. They were not Cuban-born Ladinos. They were Mende people newly taken from Africa. The documents were lies. Sengbe's story, the capture, Lomboko, the Tekora, the Middle Passage, Havana, and the Uprising was carefully recorded and would be presented in court. The world, for the first time, was listening to an African man who had been enslaved tell the truth about what had happened to him. And it was devastating. The case went to the United States District Court in Hartford, Connecticut in January 1840 before Judge Andrew Judson. This was an ironic choice of Judge. Judson was well known as an opponent of black education and African rights. Just years earlier, he had prosecuted a Connecticut school teacher for daring to educate black girls. But the law in this case was on the African side. And Judson, whatever his personal prejudices, was bound to follow the evidence. The defense presented their case methodically. The Africans were not Cuban-born. They did not speak Spanish. They were recent arrivals from Africa, specifically from Sierra Leone. The documents were fraudulent. The illegal importation of Africans was a violation of treaties that Spain itself had signed. The Van Buren administration argued for extradition to Spain. The abolitionists argued for freedom. On January 13th, 1840, Judge Judson ruled the Africans were free people who had been kidnapped from Africa. They were not property. They were not subject to Spanish jurisdiction. They should be returned to Africa. It was an extraordinary ruling, but President Van Buren was not finished. Within days, the administration appealed the ruling. The case would go to the Circuit Court, and from there, if necessary, to the Supreme Court of the United States. The fight was not over. The road to freedom would be longer and harder than anyone hoped. When the Circuit Court upheld Judge Judson's ruling in April 1840, the Van Buren administration appealed again, this time to the United States Supreme Court. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Supreme Court ruled against the Africans, they would be handed to Spain, tried for murder, and almost certainly executed. Louis Tappan needed the best legal mind available. He approached former President John Quincy Adams, the 73-year-old son of John Adams, a man who had once been among the most powerful in the nation. Adams initially hesitated. He was old. His eyesight was failing. He had not argued before the Supreme Court in decades, but he agreed because he believed in the cause. Adams spent months preparing. He read every document, every transcript, every piece of evidence. He met with Sengbe Pieh and the other Africans in Connecticut. He corresponded with abolitionists across the country. And on February 24th, 1841, John Quincy Adams stood before the Supreme Court of the United States and began one of the most famous legal arguments in American history. Adams spoke for nearly 8 hours across 2 days. He was brilliant, furious, and deeply moral. He appealed not just to law, but to the founding principles of the nation, that all men were created equal, that freedom was a natural right, that the Constitution of the United States, whatever its compromises, could not be used to return kidnapped people to slavery or death. He quoted the Declaration of Independence. He quoted international treaties. He pointed at the executive branch with barely concealed contempt, accusing Van Buren's administration of bending to slave power politics. On March 9th, 1841, the Supreme Court issued its ruling, 7 justices to 1. The Amistad Africans were free people. They had been kidnapped. They had the right to use force to regain their liberty. The United States government had no legal obligation to return them to Spain. Sengbe Pieh and his companions had won, but even after the Supreme Court victory, the Africans could not simply go home. They had no money, they needed a ship, they needed supplies, and the abolitionists who had championed their cause, good people, but not without their own complicated motives, wanted something in return. The Amistad Committee organized fundraising drives. They took Sengbe Pieh and several of the Africans on speaking tours across New England, charging admission. White Americans paid to see and hear the famous Amistad Africans in person. Sengbe Pieh was eloquent, powerful, and deeply uncomfortable with the spectacle. He tolerated it because he needed the money. He needed to go home. The abolitionists also saw an opportunity for missionary work. The Mende missionary mission was established. Several American missionaries accompanied the Africans on their return journey. This too was complicated. It is, as we shall explore later in this documentary. On November 25th, 1841, more than 2 years after the Amistad's capture of Long Island, Sengbe Pieh and 35 surviving Africans boarded a ship called the Gentleman and set sail for West Africa. They were going home, or what was left of it. On January 15th, 1842, the ship carrying Sengbe Pieh and the surviving Amistad Africans arrived at Freetown, the capital of the British colony of Sierra Leone. For many of the men, the return was joyous. For some, it was devastating. Sierra Leone had been torn by years of conflict and the ongoing raids of slave traders. Some of the men found that their villages had been destroyed. Others found their families scattered. Some found that those they loved had themselves been taken into slavery while they were away fighting for their own freedom, i.e. in American courts. The cruelest blow fell on Sengbe Pieh himself. When he made his way back to the Mende region, back to his homeland, he discovered that his wife, his children, and much of his extended family had disappeared. They had either fled the ongoing slave raids or had been taken themselves. Some sources say he searched for years and never found them. Others suggest his family may eventually have been located, though the historical record is ambiguous. This is the part of the story that gets left out of the triumphant Hollywood version. Sengbe Pieh fought for his freedom. He won, and what waited for him on the other side of that victory was grief. History does not give us a tidy ending for this man. It gives us only what he did, and what he did was extraordinary. Here is the first hidden truth about the Amistad story. It is consistently told as though the Africans were rescued by white Americans. In the popular imagination, reinforced by Steven Spielberg's 1997 film, the heroes of the Amistad are John Quincy Adams, the abolitionists, and the American legal system. But let us be precise about who saved Sengbe Pieh and the Mende captives. They saved themselves. The Africans staged the uprising. They kept each other alive for weeks at sea. They navigated the psychological and political labyrinth of American law without being broken. They gave testimony under conditions of extreme duress. John Quincy Adams gave an important speech, but he did not pick the lock with a nail in the dark hold of a ship. The abolitionists were essential allies, but allies support a struggle. They do not define it. Sengbe Pieh was not rescued, he was the rescuer. The forged identity papers at the heart of the Amistad case reveal something crucial about how the slave trade operated in 1839. The illegal transatlantic slave trade had created an entire industry of falsification. Cuban authorities were complicit. Spanish colonial officials were bribed. Documents were manufactured. The law existed on paper. Reality was something else entirely. This was not an aberration. This was the system. The slave trade could not have functioned without legal corruption at every level. And this is why the defense strategy in the Amistad case was so powerful. It did not just argue for the freedom of 53 people. It exposed the fraudulent machinery of the entire slave trade's legal infrastructure. Here is a truth that makes some people uncomfortable, but which history requires us to acknowledge. Some Africans participated in the slave trade. The men who captured Sengbe Pieh on that road near Mani were almost certainly African. The traders who sold him to the Portuguese at Lomboko were likely African. Pedro Blanco, the Spanish operator of Lomboko, worked through networks of African intermediaries. This does not create moral equivalence. The transatlantic slave trade was driven by European and American demand for cheap labor. European nations built the ships, funded the operations, created the markets, and consumed the product. Without that demand, there would have been no trade of this scale. But acknowledging the complexity, acknowledging that some African leaders made devastating choices to participate in the trade for their own gain, is part of telling the full truth. The Mende people were caught in a system that was larger than any single group, and the ones who suffered most were the ones least responsible for it. Ordinary people like Sengbe Pieh, going about their lives until violence arrived at the door. The 4 children aboard the Amistad are among the most overlooked figures in the whole story. They were caught between whales in ways the adult men were not. They had been separated from their families at even younger ages. They were kept with the adults throughout the legal proceedings, imprisoned, examined, displayed. The abolitionists educated them in Connecticut during the long legal proceedings. They learned to read English. They were baptized, some willingly, some under social pressure that a child in a foreign country, imprisoned and dependent, could not easily resist. Magru, who took the name Sarah Kinson, is perhaps the most documented of the 4. After returning to Sierra Leone, she later attended Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the first colleges to accept women and black students, and returned to Sierra Leone as a teacher. She spent her life in the country that had once allowed her to be stolen. Her story is extraordinary, and almost no one knows it. The Amistad case gave American abolitionists more than a legal victory. It gave them a platform, a mission, and a purpose. The Mende mission, established by the Amistad Committee, sent American missionaries to Sierra Leone following the Africans' return. They built schools, churches, and hospitals. Some of this work was genuinely beneficial. It provided education, medical care, and community infrastructure that Sierra Leoneans themselves used and built upon. But it also came with an ideology, the belief that African people needed to be civilized and Christianized, that African spiritual traditions, the Poro and Sunday societies, the worship of Nyewo, the reverence for ancestors were inferior and needed to be replaced. This was a form of cultural colonization, well-meaning perhaps, but colonization nonetheless. The Amistad Saga, which began as a story of African agency and resistance, was partially converted into a story about American Christian benevolence. This is what happens when the victors control the narrative. Among the most overlooked figures in the Amistad Saga is Antonio, the enslaved cabin boy who belonged to Captain Farah. Antonio was an enslaved person of African descent who had grown up in Cuba. He spoke Spanish. He had worked for Captain Farah, and during the uprising, he did not join the rebels. He was kept by them as a witness and interpreter. After the Amistad was captured by the Americans, Antonio was treated not as a free person, but as property, specifically as the property of Captain Farah's estate. Antonio eventually escaped, reportedly with the help of abolitionists, and fled to Canada, where he lived out the rest of his life as a free man. His story is a reminder that the Amistad was not just a story of Mende freedom. It was a story that touched many lives, and not everyone had the same outcome. The Amistad case did not end slavery in America. Let us be completely clear about that. It did not even shift official American policy immediately. But what it did was force a public conversation that the country desperately needed to have, a conversation about the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American democracy. A nation that declared all men to be created equal was the same nation that allowed human beings to be bought and sold. The Amistad case put that contradiction on trial. The case energized the abolitionist movement. It showed that the legal system could sometimes, under the right circumstances, with the right arguments, reach the right conclusion. It showed that enslaved and formerly enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation. It brought anti-slavery arguments into the mainstream press in ways that earlier abolitionist efforts had not been able to achieve. And it drew John Quincy Adams, one of the nation's most respected elder statesmen, firmly into the abolitionist camp, giving the movement a credibility it had previously lacked with the establishment figures. Historians debate how much the Amistad case directly influenced the Civil War and emancipation, but there is no doubt it was part of the accumulating moral pressure that made slavery unsustainable. The Amistad Africans showed that enslaved people would fight, had always been fighting for their freedom. This was not a comfortable fact for Southern slaveholders. The case also helped solidify the argument, later made in the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision absurdly in the opposite direction, that the legal status of black people in America was not settled. It was contested, and it would not be settled until the Civil War resolved it through blood. In Sierra Leone, Sengbe Pieh is a national hero. His image appears on currency. Streets are named after him. A statue stands in his honor in Freetown, but his legacy in his homeland is more complicated than the hero's welcome might suggest. After his return in 1842, Sengbe Pieh fades from the historical record. Some sources suggest he worked with the Mende mission for a period, trading goods between the mission and interior communities. Others suggest he became involved in the local trade economy in ways that were not entirely admirable. There are even accounts, disputed and possibly exaggerated, that Sengbe Pieh later participated in the internal African slave trade. These claims are contested and may be politically motivated distortions, but they illustrate how difficult it is to maintain a simple hero narrative for any human being who lived a complex life in a complex time. What is beyond dispute is this: Sengbe Pieh died on the grounds of the Mende mission in Sierra Leone in approximately 1879. He lived to old age. He had survived everything. He was buried in African soil. The Amistad rebellion sits within a long tradition of African and African American resistance to enslavement. It is connected to the rebellion of Natena in Virginia in 1831, to the escape networks of the Underground Railroad, to the oratory of Frederick Douglass, to the quiet daily acts of resistance carried out by millions of enslaved people who refused to surrender their humanity. What the Amistad added to this tradition was visibility and legal precedent. It demonstrated in the highest court in the land that Africans who had been kidnapped could not be legally held as slaves under international law. This principle would not be applied broadly or consistently. The American legal system would continue to fail black people in catastrophic ways for more than a century. But the principle existed. It had been stated. It could not be entirely erased when the civil rights movement of the 20th century made its own legal arguments, before the same Supreme Court in the same language of human rights and natural law. They were standing on ground that the Amistad Africans had helped to claim. The Amistad case immediately captured the imagination of artists and writers. In 1840, painter Nathaniel Jocelyn, a committed abolitionist, created a stunning portrait of Sengbe Pieh that became one of the most iconic images in American abolitionist history. Jocelyn painted him not as a victim or an exotic figure, but as a man of dignity and power in classical pose, looking slightly upward toward freedom. This image was radical for its time. It insisted on Sengbe Pieh's full humanity in an era when American culture systematically denied that humanity to black people. In the 20th century, the Amistad story was memorialized in poetry, theater, and novel. In 1997, Steven Spielberg's major Hollywood film brought the story to a global audience, though critics noted that the film centered white protagonists over the African ones. The film was important for raising awareness, but as with all Hollywood treatments of African history, it required the viewer to supply what the film left out: the fullness of Mende culture, the interiority of the African characters, the complexity of Sengbe Pieh as a man, not just a symbol. Today, the Amistad story is taught in schools across the United States and increasingly in Sierra Leone and West Africa. The Amistad Center for Art and Culture in Hartford, Connecticut, maintains one of the most significant collections of African American art and history in the nation. A full-scale replica of the Amistad ship, named the Freedom Schooner Amistad, was built in 2000 and has sailed as an educational vessel, traveling to ports around the Atlantic world, telling the story of its namesake. In 2015, the United States issued an Amistad commemorative stamp featuring Sengbe Pieh. And in Sierra Leone, the story of the Amistad is woven into national memory in a reminder that this small West African nation produced a man who, in the most desperate circumstances imaginable, chose freedom. What do we take from this story? Let us not reduce it to a simple moral. History is not a fable, and the people in it are not characters placed here to teach us clean lessons. But there are truths in this story that demand to be acknowledged. The first truth is about agency. Sengbe Pieh was not lucky. He was not saved by providence or white allies alone. He was a man who, in the darkest possible circumstances, used his mind, his courage, and his community to fight for his own freedom. African people have always been the primary architects of African liberation. The Amistad is a perfect example. The second truth is about the power of community. Sengbe Pieh did not free himself alone. He freed his neighbors. He built a coalition in the hold of a ship. He kept 52 other people alive for weeks in impossible conditions. This was not individual heroism. This was collective African solidarity. The third truth is about narrative. Whoever controls the story controls the legacy. For too long, the Amistad has been presented as a story about American justice, about white abolitionists, about the progressive arc of American law. These things happened, but they are not the center of the story. The center of the story is a Mende man with a nail in his hand and his family in his heart. The Amistad tells us that freedom is not given, it is taken, it is argued for, it is sailed toward, even when the navigator is lying to you about the direction. It is fought for in courts and on decks and in the long, quiet spaces of a man's mind when he refuses to accept that his life belongs to someone else. Sengbe Pieh was an African man, a Mende man, a farmer, a father, and one of the greatest freedom fighters in the history of the world, Remember his name, not Joseph Sengbe, the name the slavers' documents gave him, Sengbe Pieh. That is who he was. That is the story of the Amistad, the story of 53 Mende men, women, and children who refused to become property. The story of Sengbe Pieh, a man who carried the weight of his community's freedom across an ocean and into history. This story belongs to Africa, and now it belongs to you. If this documentary moved you, if it showed you something new about who African people are and what they have always been capable of, please take one moment to like this video, subscribe to Africa Hidden History if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs to know this story, because representation matters, because truth matters, because the names we remember and the names we allow to be forgotten shape the world our children will inherit. We will not allow Sengbe Pieh to be forgotten on this channel. Coming up next on Africa Hidden History, the Kingdom of Dahomey and the Agoji, the legendary all-female warriors who defended one of West Africa's most powerful empires. Their story is fiercer, more complex, and more surprising than anything Hollywood has shown you. That documentary is coming soon. Until then, stay curious, stay proud, and remember, Africa's history is your history.